streaming. All right, we are live on Facebook. I'm really excited about that. Yeah, so I will go ahead and do the intros really briefly. I'm Rachel Lorenzo. I'm the founder and co-executive director at Indigenous Women Rising, and this is the first part of our community teach-in series. Today is actually the first day that the Real ID Act goes into effect, and this is just the best moment ever to get some clarity on what the law means for abortion and reproductive health access, and then hear how it might impact Native people. So first I'll introduce Lauren. Lauren Van Schilfgaard from Cochiti Pueblo is assistant professor of law. Her research focuses on tribal sovereignty and federal Indian law. She previously was at the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, director of the Tribal Legal Development Clinic at UCLA Law. She received her undergraduate degree from Colorado College and her law degree from UCLA School of Law. Van Schilfgaard.
That's good.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Lauren.
And Mikkel. Okay. Davies is currently the Associate General Counsel at the National Network of Abortion Funds, where she works on a variety of legal and policy issues and supports the work of abortion funds across the country. Should I stop there? You want to keep going? Okay, all right. Yeah, is there anything either of y'all would like to add before I put up the slides?
Not for me, just so happy to be here.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna do this slide. Oops. Okay, now I'm going to share. All righty. Whoops.
Awesome.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and walk us through what we know, what we don't know, which is quite a bit, and what we might be able to expect about the implementation of Real ID and how it might impact those traveling for abortion care or really for other purposes as well. I feel the need to start off by giving a couple of disclaimers and just say that this is information and practical guidance, but it is not legal advice. So if you have specific legal questions about how Real ID might impact you, I have slides with resources on them that I'll share that can point you in the right direction to help you get the legal support and resources you need to fit your specific circumstances. I also just feel the need to disclaim that I'm not an expert on all of the intricacies of how Real ID intersects and impacts peoples with various immigration statuses or other identities, but I have been doing a lot of thinking about how Real ID might impact abortion funds and people seeking abortion care and needing to travel. And as part of that, have gathered quite a bit of information that I hope will be helpful and grounding for people today. Next slide, please. So first off, what is Real ID? Real ID is a federal law that was passed actually in 2005. So it's been around for about 2 decades as a reaction to 9/11. The law sets specific requirements for state-issued driver's licenses and prohibits federal agencies from accepting driver's licenses that do not comply with those requirements. So really what this means is if the law gets to a point where it is fully enforced, which many doubt will be possible right away, and I think today shows that, and I'll get into that in just a minute, only people with Real IDs or another form of ID that is accepted by the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, will be able to board a domestic flight or access certain federal facilities, but like nuclear power plants and places like that. So you may be a little bit like, wait, this law was passed 20 years ago. Why am I just hearing about this so much now? Well, for some context, states really strongly opposed Real ID. they still see it as an immense overreach of the federal government into their authority to make state laws and set requirements for their state ID licenses. So many states, because of that opposition, flat out refused to implement Real ID and still haven't fully done it. Privacy experts also strongly oppose Real ID as it allows the federal government in some ways to collect more data and information about us and is a stepping stone to more and increasing surveillance. And in addition to states being generally ticked that Real ID was passed, it's also just complicated for states to update and issue new types of driver's licenses. Not to mention, it takes people a lot of time to go into the DMVs and update their licenses. So all of these factors have led the federal government to delay implementation of Real ID many, many times, which is why even now so many folks do not have Real IDs or even know that they might need one. So because of all of that, a lot of people believe, and frankly, today shows us too, that it's not going to be possible for TSA to implement Real ID that quickly. And they basically said that. They've said that they plan to do a phased enforcement of Real ID over the next 2-year period. And we got news yesterday that Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem told Congress during a hearing that travelers right now who do not have a Real ID starting today will still be able to travel after they do additional security checks. She said travelers may be asked to go into a separate security line and undergo additional screening. And while we don't totally know exactly what that process will look like, and it might be airport or TSA agent dependent, it seems likely that TSA is going to keep using a process that they've used before for people who don't have an ID. And I'll go into that more in just a minute. TSA did mention today and yesterday that people without Real IDs should give themselves lots of extra time to go through airport security. It may be, helpful to recommend for abortion seekers or really anyone needing to travel and, be somewhere on a certain day to arrive several hours earlier than usual, given the likelihood of long lines. It doesn't really appear today from live reporting that there was a lot of significant delays at airports. There were some, but it wasn't the mass chaos I think that people were anticipating it could be. But Wednesday is also a very low travel volume day, and TSA was basically saying that they expect that to possibly get worse in the next few weeks or months as Real ID is enforced more strictly over time. Next slide, please. So how might enforcement of Real ID impact you? I think it's pretty safe to say all travelers, regardless of whether they have a Real ID or not, may experience long security lines as TSA scrambles to ramp up their enforcement of Real ID. And then depending on who you are and what IDs you may have, you may need to be mindful of increased risk and consider alternative travel options. So I'll talk about this more in a couple of slides, but for example, if you are an undocumented person or helping an undocumented person travel, or if you are trans or gender expansive and your passport or ID is expiring, there may be increased risks with domestic airline travel. I'll go more into this specifically in just a moment, but I just wanted to name that up front, that it's not, the risk right now is not universally applied to folks traveling without a Real ID. If you don't have a Real ID, not all hope is lost. TSA will accept other forms of identification, including valid passports, both US passports, and if someone has a foreign passport that's not expired, they'll accept that as well. They'll also accept trusted traveler cards like Global Entry, permanent resident cards, which is also what green cards are, and photo IDs issued by federally recognized tribal nations, including enhanced tribal cards. And I'll let Lauren talk about that in just a moment. Next slide, please. So how might enforcement of Real ID impact you? If you don't have a Real ID or any other of those alternative options I just mentioned, it is possible that TSA will continue to allow passengers to pass through airport security with that additional screening while they implement this phased enforcement. I don't anticipate that that will be true forever, but for right now, and I think for over the next at least 2 years, that can be expected. But like I said, we don't know exactly how this will look for each person, and it will likely be discretionary from the TSA agent. So right now, for those without any ID, TSA goes through an identity verification process, which includes collecting information such as your name and current address to confirm your identity. So some of the ways they might try to verify that you are who you say you are is they may ask you if you have other alternative IDs to back up the information you have, like a school ID, credit cards with your name on it, or other items in your wallet or on your person that basically corresponds with what you're saying your name is.
If I may, I have
Yep.
a funny anecdote. My late father-in-law was a chronic forgot his wallet when he went to travel, and always super annoying. And he was disabled, so he was in a wheelchair, so it was already like a whole thing to go travel on an airplane. But because of that, he probably got a lot of grace too. But as part of this process, prescription medication is often a great way to verify this. They would like wheel him away to a back room. Some of the questions would involve calling neighbors to verify his identification. It ended up turning into like almost like a background check, but they really are trying to just like verify that you are the person that's on your ticket, which I think is a critical point. Like, what's the purpose for all of this verification, right? It's to verify who you are, like that says that is on the plane ticket, but it can become a very, very involved process.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I think really, like, definitely the point is they're just trying to make sure that your name is, you are who you say you are. Um, some other ways that they might do that is they also might have you sign a form that just says that you declare that you're the person that you say you are, or they use what's called an ID verification call center, which basically like compiles information from data brokers, which take like your credit card information. It takes like your ad, like the way advertisers target you basically, and they compile like a profile on you, and they'll ask you questions like, have you lived at this address? Do you know, like, can you answer questions about this person who is your family member? And things like that. They could escalate to like the final kind of say is they have a, a TSA security director or designee, and they can give the thumbs up or thumbs down for whether you can go through security. And just one note, if you don't agree to provide any of the information like that they ask for, like what's your address, what's your name, can we call your neighbor, can we see your prescription bottle, you're likely to be turned away from the security checkpoint and not permitted to board your flight. A couple quick notes. If you are a young person or helping a young person travel, TSA doesn't require those under 18 to provide an ID if they are traveling with someone who does have an adult who does have an acceptable form of identification. And for those between 15 and 17 who might be traveling by themselves, there's this recommendation they have some form of ID, but I think that may mean that they have like a school ID or something else that has their name on it with them. You can always contact the airline for more information specifically for young people traveling. They'll have specific requirements available. Next slide, please. So you might be asking, how do I get a real ID? The best way to do that is to visit your state's driver's licensing agency website to find out exactly what documentation is required to get a real ID. You will not be the first people that have had this question, and so they should have that information really prominently displayed on their website. At a minimum, you'll need to provide documents showing that your full legal name, your date of birth, social security number, 2 proofs of primary address, and that you have citizenship or are a permanent resident. And you can prove those couple of things with a U.S. birth certificate, a U.S. passport, certificate of naturalization, a certificate of citizenship, or a permanent resident card. And states can and do require additional documentation, so be sure to check that website so you have everything that you need. I think really importantly, states can and likely will continue to issue IDs that do not comply with Real ID to people who do not meet the requirements. So for example, if you are an undocumented person or are unable to prove that you have citizenship, you can still get a driver's license in many states. A couple of notes if you are trans or gender nonconforming, you might want to check in with your local support organizations before trying to update your name or gender marker as you try to obtain a real ID. Depending on the state, there may be some increased surveillance or risk associated with that, and it's good to check in with those organizations on the ground. And the same if you are undocumented, it may not be possible to update your current state ID to a real ID since it might be difficult to prove that you have citizenship. If you are undocumented and have questions about real ID, there are many legal resources available to you, and I will link those in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. So a lot of folks don't realize that they might already have a real ID. And so the way that you can know most definitively is if there is a star in the upper right-hand corner of your ID. Yep. If there's not a star, some states have enhanced driver's license written in the top right-hand corner, but all of these IDs on the screen are real ID compliant. And then I was like, when I was looking at it, I was like, what's the actual difference between a real ID and just like a regular old driver's license? And the truth is, it's just that watermarking. It's just those different colors and the kind of like texture on the driver's license to make it more difficult to counterfeit or to, create fake IDs. And then the other thing is they're scannable, which that's the only real differences between them. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about a little bit more in depth about Real ID's impact on undocumented folks. So undocumented individuals will face the most barriers to air travel and the most risk with the enforcement of Real ID. It may still be possible to travel domestically if you can pass through TSA security by proving you are who you say you are, that your name is the name on the ticket. But there might be some increased legal risk with that. These resources on the right-hand side of the screen are really wonderful and are ways that folks can connect with immigration attorneys across the country. And these slides will be available, so folks will be able to click the hyperlinks. Next slide, please. Real ID enforcement will likely require individuals to update their gender markers on their ID, which may create additional barriers, like I mentioned, for trans and gender expansive folks, depending on where you live. So if you have a valid passport or alternate ID that's accepted with TSA right now with your updated name or gender marker, we would recommend considering traveling with that ID. And then depending on your state's policy, some states are making it possible to get an updated real ID that reflects your gender marker, but it's not always, that's not universally applicable. And then really quickly, just wanted to mention that the Trump administration issued an executive order impacting people's ability to have their gender markers accurately reflected on their US passports, which means that you'll want to connect with one of these legal organizations or support organizations to talk through what your options are if you are needing to update your passport. Because if you do now, it will revert back to sex assigned at birth on your passport. Next slide, please. So, talking about interacting with TSA agents or law enforcement can be really intimidating and very scary. And I do recognize that. So I want to talk a little bit about what your rights are when you're interacting with TSA agents and give a couple of important reminders for folks. So I want to be really clear is at airports, TSA agents are only responsible for conducting security screenings, which means I'm trying to emphasize that TSA officers are not actual law enforcement officers. So their role is to really look at passengers' baggage, look at like passengers' names and tickets and confirm that the names match and make sure that there's nothing on people's persons. So this does mean that TSA screeners can search you and your baggage at screening checkpoints, but what they don't have the authority to do is they cannot arrest you. That doesn't mean that there's not legal risk interacting with them because other law enforcement, such as airport police, are present at airports. And that means they can be called if TSA agents believe it is necessary. But because of TSA's role, that is generally reserved for if they find something suspicious in your bag or if they believe a crime is being committed. So it's not to say that there's no legal risk interacting with TSA agents. There are. It's just that their role is narrow and they don't have the authority to arrest you. Just some like tips for interacting with law enforcement is it is a violation of federal law to, lie to a federal agent or intentionally mislead them, but you do not need to answer all of their questions or give them all of the information they ask. So, for example, for folks traveling for abortion, if they ask you, where are you traveling to? You can say, I'm traveling to Colorado. If they say why, you can say for a doctor's appointment to visit. I'm going to stay with a family. I'm going to stay with a friend. You don't have to tell them that you're traveling to get an abortion. You just need to say something that is true, but you can be vague. And it's really unlikely that TSA agents would ask you for a destination address. They may ask you for your home address, call your neighbor, or ask you to, confirm other addresses where you have lived previously in an effort to confirm your identity, but it's highly unlikely they would be digging into where you are going and why. A quick note about medications, since I think it's both relevant and it was brought up anecdotally. TSA allows passengers to travel with medications, including medication abortion pills. And TSA does not require medications to be in a prescription bottle, although there are some state laws around this. But that's to say it's very unlikely a TSA agent would ask about medication in your bag because they allow patients to travel with medications all of the time. But say it's like, a worst case scenario and they're asking you, what is this medication? You can take the same approach. You don't have to answer their question fully or directly. You can be vague. This is a prescription from my provider. This is medicine for me to take when I get home. The medicine is for me to take related to pregnancy, or another truthful but vague statement is perfectly acceptable. And then really talking about a worst case scenario here. If a TSA officer called other law enforcement, just some reminders that you have a constitutional right to a lawyer. You also have a constitutional right to remain silent. So you do not need to speak with anyone or answer any questions without your lawyer present. And that's true anytime that you are interacting with law enforcement. And I do want to emphasize that in all types of legal cases, in all types of scenarios, evidence can't be used against you if it doesn't exist. So in this scenario, the less information you share without your lawyer present, the better. So in this unlikely and frankly worst case scenario, if someone was to be arrested while they were traveling for their abortion, they should call If When How's Repro Legal Helpline, which I've linked here and included the telephone number for. That's going to be the fastest way for someone to get the legal representation and support that they need. And then I also have linked here two really wonderful Know Your Rights resources from the ACLU. One is just generally about enforcement at the airport. And I've been talking about domestic travel because that's what Real ID is about. But this resource also talks about some about that, but also talks about traveling across borders, which carries much more heightened legal risk. And there's also a really wonderful explainer about your right as an abortion seeker, like traveling for an abortion and then helping other people get the abortions that they need. So I just talked at you a lot. I hope that was somewhat grounding about, what Real ID is, what we can expect, and I'm really excited to hear from Lauren and talk more about this.
Hell, that was a masterclass. That was amazing. I don't have slides, but I just wanted to provide a little gloss about how this may or may not impact tribes and tribal members. And yeah, I have more anecdotes. We were going through airport security, and I'm with my 6-year-old at the time, and we were frantically packing, right before we leave for the airport, like all families do. And so my kids packed their own toy bag, and so his toy bag is going through the security, and as we're watching it go through, he leans up to me and whispers, "I packed my catapult." And I was like, oh, like not a real catapult because those are massive, but like a toy one that is solid metal and weighs like 4 pounds. So he's carrying this around. But it did occur to me, it was like, oh, that could be a weapon. It's this giant metal thing. And it also is a little weapon. Huh. So it's like, okay. We just watched it go through security, and it went through, and I'm sure they saw it and was like, that's hilarious. But it was like, oh, they see all sorts of things. But not to make light, I think at that moment I definitely had like a sense of like we could be going on a journey right now, because that is what it feels like. It's an incredibly vulnerable position. We're at immense discretion. I think Mikkel is exactly right. TSA has a very specific authority, but it is authority within a very, very vulnerable position that could expose one to a whole plethora of other authorities, including local law enforcement, as well as immigration officials. I think that's why there has been general resistance to this idea about a national ID. This has been an incredibly controversial idea for the entire history of this country. There's been long resistance to this, and it frankly was the events of 9/11 that finally spurred like, no, we want something. I think it's important to note that this is still a relatively narrow conception of a national ID, that it's for the purposes of domestic air travel, but nevertheless, like one more like a step closer towards show me your papers, which is where we're at. I think states are absolutely right to resist. A driver's license is not a formal identification. It is a license to drive, but it has in many ways been hijacked to form this national ID purpose. This is also true for a tribal identification card. Tribal identification cards are incredibly important, if for no other reason, a first order principle of tribal sovereignty. This is the vehicle by which a tribe can express its own membership criteria, its own identification criteria, its own service to tribal members to allow an easy ID card. Tribes are, as their own distinct sovereigns, have their own criteria for what a tribal ID can and should include and how one gets access to. Some have no expiration date. You get your ID card, and if you lose it, you have to pay the fee to go get another one, but otherwise you can have it forever. Other ID cards expire. Some ID cards have a photo on it, many don't. Those two things are really important because that can implicate the extent to which a tribal identification card is accepted, either as a real ID compliant card or otherwise, the presence of a photo as well as an expiration date. So even an ID card that's not real ID compliant, Mikkel provided that really helpful list of TSA alternative forms of identification card. It's not all tribal ID cards. It's only those that have a photo ID on them, and arguably also those that have an expiration date on them. So it's important to check those. A lot of tribes have been really on top and monitoring this real ID progression and are offering their own real ID or enhanced ID alternatives to tribal members. And so that's great, but not all are, not even all states are. And so it's really, really important to look at. I remember going in for my own real ID for my California DMV. It was so much worse than New Mexico DMV. I don't know why that is the case, but it's crazy. So I'm standing in line and like trudging through. Part of the criteria is you have to provide your social security number, a document that proves that's your social security number. That in most instances is your actual social security card. This tiny like flimsy paper that they issue that's supposed to last your lifetime. It's really bizarre. For those of you that have gone through a name change, either for whatever reason, you know it's a nightmare. It's really, really intense to change your name, including to change your name on your social security card. That is a necessary step in order to get a real ID. Not only do you need to show all of these documents, your name has to be the same on them. So I'm standing in line, and this lady, bless her heart, had no idea. She had been married for 20 years and didn't know that she needed to change her name at the Social Security office. She was denied a real ID on that day and instructed, you need to go to the Social Security office to go through the name change that you should have done 20 years ago before you can be eligible for a real ID. This, I think, is one of many massive steps here, especially for those of you that are going through a name change. For those of you that have transitioned and are facilitating a name change that often requires a court hearing, only one step of many logistics that has to go through. This can be a very time-consuming and expensive process that I think is just one of many things that has to be considered, including to match that on your tribal ID. We talked about flying without an ID, which is super fun. I also wanted to make a brief mention about the US citizenship of Native people. On the one hand, it's like hilarious, right? As Indigenous people, like we literally predate the United States, are from this land in ways that, right, many Americans aspire to. On the other hand, Native Americans are not do not obtain citizenship via the 14th Amendment. This was just like super academic, like nerdy fodder until we saw the executive order regarding birthright citizenship issued by the Trump administration in the first hours of the administration. This is an incredibly concerning executive order for all Americans, specifically for the children of immigrants, which is most Americans. But it turns out is also concerning for Native Americans, in part because in their briefing defending this birthright citizenship executive order, the Department of Justice cited specifically to the status of citizenship for Native Americans, potentially coloring citizenship status for Natives. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act provided unilateral, non-consensual citizenship on all Native Americans. That was without the consent, but also impacted only some Native Americans because many others had obtained citizenship via other vehicles. That was amended in 1940 with the Nationality Act, which then required that all Native Americans born in the United States and the child of a tribal member have citizenship. It is, again, just like academic, but it does mean that the path towards citizenship is different for Natives than it is for all other Americans, which get there via the 14th Amendment, which states all persons born in the United States are automatically citizens. It arguably means that to prove citizenship for Natives, not only do I need a birth certificate showing that my place of birth was within the United States, but I might also need the tribal membership status of one of my parents. I bring this up just because it's like kind of nerdy and fun, but also a potential legal hump should someone want to make life difficult. In this case of accessing a real ID. The path to citizenship is just different. A passport, a birth certificate, arguably are sufficient, but I do think there are potential legal complications there. The two proofs of address, I also think, is a particular potential hurdle that will have disproportionate impacts on Native communities. For the same reason that we saw nefarious activities coming out of a number of jurisdictions, but including North Dakota, requiring a proof of address in order to vote. That's because many Natives who live on tribal lands lack a physical address and instead only have a P.O. box. That's because many homes on reservations just haven't been numbered. There's not a street name, or if there is a street name, there's not a numbered address for the home. And so a proof of address could prove difficult if your home, again, that's on tribal lands, might lack the sort of logistical clarity that is being sought here. All of this also requires just the collection of a lot of documents that one may or may not have access to for a lot of different reasons, including persons that are in incredibly vulnerable situations, including victims of domestic violence. the legal community is finally starting to gain some understanding about the nature of economic and other types of abuse that it can include holding another person's documents and access to their own financial records. That can be incredibly impactful in a situation like this. And so simply gaining all of the documentation necessary in order to qualify for a real ID. Finally, I think another barrier are the governments themselves, both tribal governments as well as state governments. I'm down for the resistance. I think that the justification for a national identification just hasn't been really persuasively made yet. But to the extent it's here, we definitely have I would argue this is a clunky onboarding. I think despite Mikkel's beautiful presentation, that's the most clarity I've received about what's required and why it's required. It's very confusing, and I think that we can anticipate that while this is starting with TSA, it's going to grow legs. Like the writing's on the wall, we can see it here, but it's unclear how, why, or where. And so I think this confusion is unfortunately going to be borne by us, not by the governments. I really applaud tribal governments that have tried to get in front of this and try to make access, prioritize access for tribal members, as well as try to get tribal IDs in line with this. But there are cross purposes working here. There's friction, and I'm definitely sympathetic about to the extent we want to make our information even more exposed. It's a huge issue. I think time will tell to see how the implementation goes. But I I think it's going to be problematic. I think the resources that Mikkel has provided are incredibly important. I was talking earlier today, I think some of the advice I can offer, which is not very satisfying, is to remember to stay calm if one is diverted into a line. Right now, this is just applying to domestic flights, right? International flights, including to Canada and Mexico, still require a US passport. That is also happens to be Real ID compliant, but it's important to note that's like a higher standard than what's going on here. But when in a vulnerable situation, it's exactly that. You know, it's not just your own personal safety and well-being, but that of your companions and family. There are resources available. You are not required to divulge anything that you're not comfortable with. But I think, you know, creating a scene puts you more at risk. Those are risks that I merely ask that you take into consideration. You do you, but this is definitely a new chapter that I think will be referring to the before and after May 7th, 2025.
Thank you both so much. I think just from like an abortion funding standpoint, I really encourage my sibling funds across the country to consider a real ID fund within their abortion fund. It's something that Indigenous Women Rising has been preparing for, and we're still not quite there yet to make this accessible to Native folks who do need to get real ID compliant. There's
Oh, I just want to, that's such a great idea, right? There are fees if you are requesting a new certified copy
Yep.
of your birth certificate from your county. There are fees if you're like seeking to change your name or get a new social security card. Both documents that are required in order to get a real ID.
Yeah, so for example, that's a really excellent point. So on top of the fee to just get the driver's license, the time that you have to spend at the Social Security Administration office, here in Albuquerque, when I got married and I made the decision to change my last name to my husband's last name, I spent about 6 hours at Social Security. And so like there's that cost per hour that you're missing out on your day's wages. Birth certificate can be anywhere from $10 to $20.
And it probably is not going, it's probably not better today, especially as we know federal employees have been gutted, including at the
Yeah.
Social Security Administration.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
is a tough, tough task.
They
Yeah.
were reporting today DMV wait times were between 4 and 6 hours in some places. So this is such a good point, Rachel.
Yeah,
Ugh.
and then if you want to go to a DMV Express or DV, whatever it is,
Which you
um,
should, and is a shining star of the state of New Mexico.
it
And I had
really
no
is.
idea until coming to the pit of despair that is California. It is absolutely worth $25. And I personally commit to like donating to the fund to send people to the DMV Express.
Yes, because you can make an appointment at the like the state DMVs throughout your state. But a DMV Express, because it's express and because they're owned by private companies, their fees are going to be
Which
much
I
more.
otherwise don't support like privatization, but in this one tiny case, it
This
totally
one
works.
thing, it absolutely works, and they're also like super friendly. But also I know that DMV folks on the state side are like burnt out, which I get. At any rate, I really, again, I feel like I have to reiterate this, that other sibling funds across the country really take into consideration what it means to support abortion seekers and those seeking any other kinds of gender affirming care, to see how you might be able to go beyond. That's my daughter and her friend in the background. I have a teenager, so you can only imagine. I'm doing a live webinar, ma'am.
I also just wanted to note on the name change, that it's super complicated, and certainly for those that have gotten married, and or have transitioned, but also you might not think that those apply to you, but depending on the extent to which you go by your middle name or have like two
Mhm.
middle names, those are potential hiccups that are worth examining. The extent to which it's featured on your driver's license, your birth certificate, your social security card, they all need to be uniform. And
Yep.
it's such a nightmare. If you have a hyphenated name, is that consistently spelled and presented? Perhaps one name has served as primary on different documents, all things that you want to verify.
Absolutely. That's such a great point. I mean, the stories that I read of, or read the stories that I read in the news about elderly folks who didn't ever have a hyphen, but one legal document of theirs has a hyphen, and then being denied the ability to be Real ID compliant, and then having to go through this entire legal system where they have to go before some kind of like maybe magistrate or probate court in order to make some kind of change to their legal documentation. Yeah, it's a whole mess, and I think especially
I
for
think, well,
maybe.
that's a great point. I think that we should be looking out for all of our older relatives and elders, the extent to which their documents may or may not be in compliant.
Yep.
Um, and like, right, I realized like both my parents went by their middle name. Huge ramifications here.
Yeah. And so my vision for this Real ID fund that is in the works actually wouldn't just be for abortion seekers. It would be for any Native person looking to get Real ID compliant, no matter where they are. And because at some point they might need an abortion, they might need to cross state lines for some kind of healthcare. It happens all the time in Indian country where we might need some kind of specialized care that's not available in our state, or the closest kinds of healthcare are in another state right over the border because of border towns. And so, yeah, I cannot stress this enough, how important it is for yes to be radical and know how we're pushing back on the system, but also the reality is a lot of our community members are just trying to get by day to day, and if we can help ease that burden, whether it's helping with the cost of Real ID or providing know your rights information, that is our obligation to our community. um Again, these slides will be made available. They are publicly accessible as soon as I post all the things, and you'll be able to click through the different resources. If you have any questions, please email us info@iwrising.org. We'll do our very best to answer. We are not attorney. I'm not an attorney. No one at IWR is an attorney. Um, and yeah, Anything else y'all want to?
Thank you, Indigenous Women Rising. This is an incredibly important issue. And Mikkel, I learned so much. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Oh my,
thank you.
I learned so much. So thank you so much for having me. It's fun.
Well, everyone, that wraps our first community teach-in. Thank you both for being part of it, and I hope you have a somewhat restful end to your week.